Göbekli Tepe wasn't built by farmers. The world's first temple went up 11,000 years ago, hauled into place by people who hadn't yet figured out how to grow a single crop. Picture the night as it looked 30,000 years ago. Just a darkness so complete that the Milky Way doesn't whisper across the sky. It roars. A Paleolithic figure stands outside a cave in what is now France, looking up. No words for what she's seeing, no framework, just the looking. Fast forward 10,000 years. A Mesopotamian farmer stands on a flat roof above the Euphrates. The harvest is in. His children are breathing in the rooms behind him. He looks up the same way. Another 10,000. A Roman soldier on a campaign in Germania, far from the empire, whispers a prayer to gods whose names he can barely pronounce. Another 10,000 after that. A medieval woman outside a cathedral, crossing herself, her lips, moving in Latin she does not understand now. A man on a city fire escape. 3 drinks in, his job fine and his life fine and something hollow anyway. He's scrolling through his phone but he pauses, looks up at the narrow strip of stars visible between the buildings. And for just a moment he stops moving. 5 people separated by 30,000 years. Different languages, different worlds, same sky, same question. What is all of this? Why does it exist? Why do I exist? And what am I supposed to do while I'm here? That's where religion comes from. Not from priests, not from institutions, not from sacred texts. From that moment. From the silence under the stars and the human need to break it with something other than your own voice. No religion has ever answered those questions to everyone's satisfaction. Every religion tried. That is where this story begins. But before we talk about the 5 religions that survived, we need to go back to what came before them. Because religion did not begin with the Vedas or the Torah or the Buddha sitting under a tree. It began much earlier. It began the moment a human being decided that death meant something. The cave is in northern Iraq, in the Zagros Mountains. The entrance opens onto a valley that was greener then, 60,000 years ago, than it is now. A body is being placed on the ground, not thrown, not dragged, arranged. In the 1950s, the archaeologist Ralph Selecki excavated Shanidar Cave and found 9 Neanderthal skeletons. One male lay in a sleeping posture, his limbs folded carefully, his head resting as if on a pillow that had long since decayed. Around him were clusters of pollen, yarrow, cornflower, grape hyacinth. At least 20 Neanderthal burial sites show this pattern. Grave goods, placed with the dead, objects that mattered. Tools, animal bones, flowers. Selecki published his findings in 1975. The public seized on the idea instantly. Neanderthals buried their dead with flowers. It meant they grieved. It meant they had a concept of death as something other than the end. It meant they believed in something. But the evidence is more complicated than that story allows. The pollen interpretation faces several serious challenges. Some researchers argue that flowers could have been brought into the cave by burrowing animals. That the pollen is a signature of disturbance, not ritual. Others note that only one of the 9 skeletons floats who showed this signature clearly, which weakens the case for a consistent cultural practice across generations or across the broader Neanderthal world. Lewis Binford, an archaeologist known for his skepticism toward romantic interpretations of the past, pointed out that grave goods do not automatically signal religious belief. A burial could be practical, keep the body separated from the camp, discourage scavengers, without requiring any theology at all. There is a larger question underneath. What does a burial even prove? A body placed in a pit with objects does not automatically mean a religion. It might mean grief without theology. It might mean practicality. The counter-argument comes from researchers like João Ziliao, who has examined dozens of Neanderthal sites systematically His position is that the cumulative pattern, repeated careful placement across 20 sites, across thousands of years and thousands of kilometers, across different Neanderthal populations, points towards something deliberate, something learned and practiced, something passed down that does not require belief in an afterlife. It requires only the idea that the dead deserve something more than abandonment. What no one can tell you is what the Neanderthals actually thought they were doing. No words survive, no painted symbols we can read as myth, no sequence of gestures we can decode. The entire inner architecture of their world is gone. That is the ache at the bottom of this evidence. The thoughts that accompanied those actions are not just unknown. They are fundamentally unreachable. We can see the fingerprint. We cannot see the hand. And yet, someone 60,000 years ago, in a cave in what is now Iraq, lowered a body into the depression in the stone floor. They folded the limbs carefully. They walked outside into the sun, gathered armfuls of flowering plants that had known medicinal properties, brought them back into the dark. Someone made a choice about how to treat the dead. Someone decided that the body mattered beyond its material utility. Maybe they did this because they believed the dead man's spirit would need medicine on its journey to another world. Maybe they did it because the flowers smelled like the living world, and they couldn't stand the smell of the cave without them. Maybe they did it because that was simply what you did, what their parents had done, what their grandparents had done, a pattern so old it felt like instinct, as basic as breathing. Maybe all three things were true at once, and the act contained all those meanings without anyone needing to articulate them. We do not know. The silence on the other side of that moment is total. What we do have is the fingerprint of the moment preserved in pollen and bone, and that fingerprint tells us something fundamental about the impulse that would later build Göbekli Tepe, light fires on Vedic altars, carve the Pashupati seal, and raise cathedrals across continents. The caring part came first. The doctrines and the priests and the institutions came much later, and every single one of them was built on top of this older, quieter thing. The unwillingness to treat the dead like nothing. In 1940, 4 teenagers in the Dordogne region of France were walking through the woods when their dog disappeared down a hole. They widened the opening and dropped into a chamber that had been sealed for 17,000 years. What they saw on the walls by the light of a makeshift lamp was not decoration. It was a world. Roughly 600 painted animals covered the surfaces. Horses, bulls, deer, bison, ibex, felines. The painters had used the natural contours of the rock to give their animals dimension. A horse's eye is rendered in a single dark line. A bull's horns curve exactly as they would in life. Some animals are life-size. Others tower across rock face, massive and haunting. But the paintings are not in the entrance chamber where people lived, or where the light reaches. They are deep inside the cave, in passages so narrow that reaching them requires crawling on hands and knees through absolute darkness. That detail is crucial. The paintings are not casual decoration to be seen by everyone in the group. The effort to reach them, the physical discomfort, the commitment of time, the deliberate journey into deep stone is part of what the images mean. You do not paint 600 animals in chambers no one can reach, unless the darkness itself is sacred, unless the act of going down is the point. The species are chosen with precision. They are the dangerous inhabitants of the forest. The creatures a hunter or a herder would encounter beyond settlement, creatures that could kill. But they are not the animals people primarily ate. Horse bones from contemporary Paleolithic sites are rare. Bison remains are more common, yet the bison paintings at Lascaux are dwarfed by the horses. The relationship between what people hunted and what they painted is not straightforward. This is not a record of the pantry. It is something else. 17,000 years later, We are standing in the dark, trying to read a sentence in a language no one remembers. Was just. The most influential attempt to decode that language came from David Lewis Williams, a South African archaeologist, who spent decades studying the painted caves of Europe and the rock art of the San people of southern Africa. His argument is that the images are not hunting tallies or teaching diagrams or simple records of animals seen. They are maps of the human mind, or more precisely, maps of the human mind in an altered state. In certain states of consciousness, trance, sensory deprivation, the early stages of hallucinogenic experience, the human visual cortex produces consistent geometric patterns. These patterns are not cultural. They are hardwired into human neurology. A person in Australia experiencing trance will see the same shapes as a person in Europe or Africa. The abstract signs that appear alongside the animals at Lascaux, the grids, the dots, the nested curves, the hand stencils, match the geometric patterns documented in modern studies of trance states. In this reading, the cave wall was a membrane between worlds, not a canvas for external images. The animals were already there, inside the rock, waiting in the spirit world. The painter's job was not to invent them, but to trace them, to release them onto stone so others could see what the shamans saw when they went into the dark and their minds crossed over. This would explain the remote location. You do not need to walk for hours and crawl through passages to see a hunting record. But you might walk for hours to reach a place of spiritual power. You might crawl through stone passages to enter a vision space. But other scholars point out serious difficulties with this interpretation. If cave art was shamanic visioning, why are the animals not more overtly fantastic or impossible? Trance imagery often includes distortions, hybridization, strange proportions. The Lascaux animals are naturalistic. They look like animals you could actually encounter. Some interpretations propose instead that the paintings were hunting magic. Paint the animal, control the animal, ensure the kill. But if that were the purpose, why paint them in chambers so remote that hunters could not display them to others? Why hide what you need to see before a hunt? Another reading proposes that the paintings are teaching tools, a way of encoding knowledge about animal behaviour, hunting techniques, seasonal patterns. But the chambers are too remote, too dangerous, too sacred in their atmosphere to function as schools. Recent hypothesis suggests the animals represent constellations, star maps painted on cave walls, a way of encoding astronomical knowledge. This would explain why certain animals appear together, why they seem to follow patterns of movement and relationship, why some are painted over others as if correcting a previous version. Yet no one has produced a convincing correlation between the painted animals and any documented constellation systems from any culture. All of these theories grapple with the same irreducible problem. We have 600 paintings, thousands of hand stencils, abstract marks that clearly meant something, but we do not have a single word from the people who made them. No explanation survives except the images themselves, and images mean different things to different eyes. The painters thought something. They felt something urgent enough to descend into absolute darkness with a burning lamp, to spend hours making images that almost no one would ever see. But what they thought is gone. The only certainty is the choice itself. The choice to make something difficult, to hide it, to know that almost no one would witness it, and to do it anyway. What makes the silence stranger is the time scale. Lascaux was painted over a relatively short period. A few thousand years, maybe less, around 17,000 years ago. But the tradition it belongs to stretched much further back. Cave painting in Europe began at least 40,000 years ago, possibly earlier. The oldest known figurative painting in the world is an Indonesian handprint from roughly 40,000 years ago. A human hand pressed against stone, marked with ochre, a mark saying, "I was here." That means generations of painters were born, learned the techniques from their elders, descended into caves, added their animals to the herds on the walls, and died. Century after century, the paint faded. New painters added new layers. The tradition evolved, but persisted. The open question, does this continuity imply a single belief system, one religion, spanning the entire continent of Europe across 20 millennia? The most durable spiritual tradition in human history, and one we cannot read a single syllable of? Or does it suggest that something deeper than any single belief, the impulse to make marks that matter, to hide them, to know they would outlast the maker, was the constant, that the belief changed but the practice endured? Maybe the paintings mapped shamanic visions. Maybe they charted the stars. Maybe they were hunting prayers, initiation tests, ancestor veneration, or fertility magic. Maybe they were the work of individual artists with no shared theology at all, just a personal compulsion to make large animals appear on stone in the deepest places they could reach. Maybe different chambers held different meanings, painted in different eras for different purposes, and we are looking for unity where none existed. The paintings do not tell us. What they do tell us is that the impulse to create sacred space, to separate a place from ordinary life, to mark it with images that meant something more than decoration, to make the effort to reach it part of the act itself, was already old when the first stone was laid at Göbekli Tepe. The human need to go into the dark and bring something back, to push through discomfort and danger toward a wall that was never going to be seen by everyone, to invest labour and simple skill in something that served no material survival purpose. This was not invented by temples or priests. It was already there, 17,000 years before any known scripture, in the limestone galleries under the hills of the Dordogne, where animals still run by the light of lamps no one has lit since the ice was thick over northern Europe. The hills of southeastern Turkey roll in dry brown waves, unremarkable from a distance. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was surveying the region when he noticed a mound that looked artificial. What he uncovered over the next 20 years rewrites what we know about civilization's origins. The site is not a village. It has no houses, no hearths for daily cooking, no midden pits full of household rubbish. What it has is circles. Each circular enclosure contains between 10 and 12 massive T-shaped limestone pillars. Up to 5.5 meters tall, the largest pillars weigh 20 tons, roughly the weight of 4 adult African elephants. The people who quarried, carved, transported, and erected these stones did it without wheels, without draft animals, without metal chisels. They used stone hammers and stone wedges. They carved with the same rock they were moving. The logistics alone speak to an extraordinary level of coordination. Teams had to quarry the stone, shape it with precision, then move it across terrain without roads. Conservative estimates suggest each major pillar required the labour of hundreds of people working in concert. The oldest layer at Göbekli Tepe was built around 9600 BCE, 11,600 years ago, and the site was used continuously for more than 1,000 years before being deliberately buried under tons of rubble. To anchor that in time, when the first stone was laid here, the last ice age had ended only a few centuries earlier. The woolly mammoth was not yet extinct. Agriculture did not exist anywhere on Earth. Wheat was still a wild grass. Jericho, the oldest known permanent settlement, would not be founded for another 600 years. There was no pottery, no writing, no domesticated livestock, no village life anywhere on the planet. The largest human settlements were temporary camps of a few hundred people, and here in the limestone hills, people were moving stones the weight of elephants. Every assumption about civilization says that cities come first. You settle down, you farm, you produce a surplus, you specialize, and then, eventually, you build temples. Religion is supposed to be a luxury of stability. Göbekli Tepe flips that logic and breaks it into pieces. Religion did not wait for civilization. Civilization followed religion. The pillars are not plain. Their surfaces teem with carved animals. Foxes with long curling tails, snakes slithering in lateral waves, cranes with their legs lifted in mid-step, boars, scorpions, spiders, wild sheep, vultures, predators and prey together. No obvious hierarchy. Some pillars have arms carved in low relief along their sides, hands reaching toward the belly, as if the pillar itself is a body. The T-shape echoes a human form, a head, shoulders, a torso, stone beings standing in circles, covered with animals, but no faces. The central pillars are headless, featureless, human in profile, but utterly blank. Who they represent? Ancestors, deities, spirit guardians, the dead made stone, beings from another world. The carvings do not say. The absence of a face is as eloquent as any image would be. These are not portraits, they are presences. At the site, archaeologists found tens of thousands of animal bones, mostly gazelle and aurochs, many butchered in ways suggesting large-scale communal meals. The bones are not scattered randomly. They cluster in certain areas, suggesting deliberate placement. Stone troughs show chemical residues of oxalate, the fingerprint of grain fermentation. They were not just worshipping here, they were eating, drinking, gathering in numbers that their normal wandering lives could never accommodate. The feasts were not incidental. They were central to why people came. The food was part of the ritual. Over more than a millennium, new circles were added, old ones filled in, the hilltop refashioned again and again. Each generation inherited the stone structures and added to them. The effort was continuous, and must have been overwhelming enough that generation after generation of hunter-gatherers returned to the same stone hill and added their labour to the accumulation. This was not a single construction event. This was 1,000 years of return, of renewal, of generations choosing to participate in something they did not build but could add to. Here is the part that should stop you cold. Around 8000 BCE, after more than 1,000 years of use, the entire site was systematically buried. Tons of rubble, limestone chips, earth, broken tools were piled into every enclosure until the pillars were covered. The burial was deliberate, careful, as though the circles were not being destroyed but laid to rest. After the burial, Göbekli Tepe was abandoned. No one returned. No new structure was built on top. The stone beings were sealed beneath the earth and left. Why? Klaus Schmidt speculated that the hunter-gatherer world was changing, that the rise of agriculture was making Göbekli Tepe obsolete. Perhaps the ritual requirement that drew thousands of people to a stone hill was no longer necessary once people settled in villages and could gather at will. Perhaps the sacred site was deliberately closed, its purpose fulfilled, its power acknowledged through burial rather than use. Perhaps it was simply forgotten. Some catastrophe or plague made people abandon the site, and subsequent generations did not know what lay beneath the soil. But speculation is all it is. Schmidt died in 2014 without answering the question he spent 2 decades asking. We have no human remains from Göbekli Tepe. No bones, no burials, no trace of the individuals who built it. We have no writing, no oral tradition that survived 11,000 years, no myth that anyone can plausibly claim describes this place. We have stones carved with extraordinary skill by people who had not yet invented the pot. We have a temple built before any known house, a sanctuary constructed for a faith we cannot reconstruct. The builders came from the hills and plains of what is now Turkey, northern Syria, possibly as far as the Euphrates. They converged on this hilltop for reasons so urgent to them that they moved stones the weight of elephants without wheels. The motivation must have been powerful enough to overcome the obvious costs. The labour, the danger, the time investment that could have been spent hunting or gathering. Something compelled them. Something they could not refuse. They did not build roads to get there. Roads require a degree of permanence, of planning across generations, that settled agriculture makes possible. These were walking people. They moved across landscape without marking it. They left no trail except the one worn by 10,000 feet, walking the same route across centuries. Stone tools from the site have been sourced to a region spanning 150 kilometers in every direction. People walked for days, probably for weeks, to reach this hilltop. They did not ride. They did not have roads. They crossed open plains where predators still hunted. They arrived at the top of a bare hill, with no shelter, no permanent water, no reason to be there except the one they carried inside themselves. They did the work, they feasted, they performed rituals whose exact choreography we will never know, and then they left. And when they arrived, they did not build huts because they were not staying. They built a monument that had no precedent anywhere on Earth. They moved stones, they feasted, they performed rituals whose structure we will never know, and then, 1,000 years later, they buried it all and walked away. Before we go any further, whether you're watching this closely or letting it play in the background as you drift off to sleep, both are why I make these. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I read them, and the range of places and hours genuinely surprises me. What the Göbekli Tepe silence tells us is that the impulse to build something that serves no practical purpose, that requires coordination across a wide region, that signals something to people not yet born, that impulse is older than farming. It is older than anything we would call civilization. It is as old as the human capacity to imagine something beyond the immediate, to sacrifice present comfort for a future meaning, to agree that something is sacred. Around 3300 BCE, a sprawling urban culture appeared in the floodplains of the Indus River and its tributaries in what is now Pakistan and northwest India. It was not a small settlement. It was the largest civilization of the ancient world, larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, stretching nearly 1,000 miles from the Arabian Sea to the foothills of the Himalayas. At its peak, it contained perhaps 5 million people. Its two largest cities, Mohenjo-Daro on the lower Indus and Harappa on the Ravi River, were masterpieces of urban planning. Gridded streets at right angles, covered drainage systems that would not be matched again for thousands of years in Europe. Public baths built from precisely kilned brick, with hot water systems that show sophisticated engineering. Granaries that could feed tens of thousands and preserve grain against drought. Weights and measures standardized across hundreds of miles, suggesting a unified system of commerce and law. And yet no palace has ever been found. No royal tomb. No temple. That absence is not an accident of excavation. Egyptian cities have temples at their centre, with massive pylons and painted reliefs, and priesthoods documented in written records. Mesopotamian cities have ziggurats rising from their centres, visible from miles away, undeniable statements of religious hierarchy and cosmic order. Indus cities have massive public platforms, but nothing that reads as a shrine for gods. No altars, no cult statues, no processional ways, no evidence of a centralised priesthood, controlling religious authority and accumulating wealth. The religious life of the Indus people, whatever it was, did not leave architecture behind. It did not inscribe itself on stone for the gods to see. What it did leave is small, Steatite seals, mostly less than 3 centimeters across, used to stamp impressions into clay for trade and administration. On one seal found at Mohenjo-Daro, dated to roughly 2600 to 1900 BCE, sits a figure that has been arguing with scholars for 100 years. The seal shows a central human form, seated on a low throne. The legs are folded, the heels drawn close to the body, the arms extended with hands resting on the knees. A posture any yoga practitioner would recognize instantly. From the head rise 2 great curving horns. Surrounding the seated figure are 4 wild animals arranged in facing pairs. An elephant and a tiger on one side, a rhinoceros and a water buffalo on the other. John Marshall, the archaeologist who led the Mohenjo-Daro excavations, saw that seal and gave it a name that has stuck ever since: the Pashupati seal. Pashupati means Lord of Animals, current epithet of the Hindu god Shiva, who is often depicted as a yogi, often associated with wild beasts and ascetic practices, often shown in a meditative posture that mirrors this 4,000-year-old carving. Marshall looked at a piece of carved soapstone and saw a proto-Shiva, a god of yoga and beasts walking backward through time into the Indus civilization. It is a straightforward reading. It offers a line from the Indus Valley to the Hinduism we know today, a continuity stretching back more than 4 millennia, an unbroken thread from the modern world to one of history's greatest lost cities. But the seal comes with no caption. No name is written, no legend explains. The figure's horns could signal a deity, but they could also signal a shaman wearing a ritual headdress. They could mark a priest performing a sacred function, or a king displaying his authority, or a mythical being whose significance is lost. Is the figure dominating the beasts, sitting among them as one creature among many? The animals are not cowering. They are positioned symmetrically, almost peacefully. They are arranged as if in balance, as if all the wild creatures of the world have agreed to sit still and listen to someone speak. Then there are the terracotta figurines. Across the Indus sites, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Dholavira, archaeologists have found thousands of small clay female figures. They are crude, hand-modelled, often with exaggerated hips and breasts. Some wear elaborate headdresses, some are clearly worn smooth from handling, their surfaces polished by fingers that touched them repeatedly over years. The standard interpretation is that they represent a mother goddess, a fertility figure at the centre of domestic worship. Hinduism would later have Shakti, the divine feminine, at the heart of many traditions. These figures could be her ancestors, worshipped in homes, passed from mother to daughter, touched for blessings or fertility. But reasonable is not the same as proven. The figurines could be votive offerings, objects made as a gift to a deity. They could be children's toys, objects for teaching or play. They could be ancestral portraits, meant to preserve the image of someone dead. They could be teaching models for childbirth, used to instruct young women on what to expect. They could be something we have no modern word for, because the category did not survive. The clay does not tell. The hands that made them cannot speak. What is clear is that Indus religion, if the word even applies, was domestic and communal, not institutional. No centralized priesthood emerges from the archaeology. The public baths may have served a ritual purpose, or may have been purely practical, a way to manage hygiene in a dense urban environment of millions. The seals may have been ritual objects, or may have been business documents, impressed with clay to certify a transaction. The figurines may have been sacred, or may have been ordinary household goods. The silence is total. The script is the thing that makes all of this maddening. The Indus people wrote. They left more than 4,000 inscribed objects, mostly seals and small copper tablets, covered in a script that contains around 400 distinct signs. Most inscriptions are between 5 and 7 characters. Every claimed decipherment has collapsed under scrutiny. The sequences are too short. The underlying language unknown. The bilingual inscription that would crack it stubbornly absent from the soil. Some researchers have proposed that the script is not a language at all, but a system of symbols. Logos representing guilds or religious concepts, or ownership marks. We do not know. And then, around 1300 BCE, the Indus civilization vanishes from the record. Not destroyed in a single catastrophic event, but gradually abandoned. The cities emptied. The urban system dissolved. Writing fell out of use. For the next several hundred years, the Indus plains seem to have been inhabited only by small pastoral settlements. The archaeology offers no clear explanation for the collapse. Climate change, as the Sarasvati River dried up around 1900 BCE, would have undermined the agricultural base. Agricultural failure and famine would have driven people away. Invasion or warfare. Social breakdown and the collapse of the trade networks that held the civilization together. A shift in river patterns. All have been proposed. None is definitive. The greatest city of the ancient world simply ceased to be, and no one wrote down the reason. What we know for certain is that continuity between Indus religion and Vedic religion, between the Pashupati seal and later Shiva worship, is not proven. It is an inference. The seal could be depicting an entirely different being, worshipped by an entirely different people for entirely different reasons. When the new scripts and texts emerge in the Vedic period, they do not reference the Indus past. They do not mention the cities. They do not acknowledge the people who came before. The conquest narratives in the Rig Veda describe battles won, fortresses destroyed, but the cities they conquered may not have been the Indus cities. The Indus civilization may have simply been forgotten, or may have merged gradually with new populations until no one remembered it had been separate. The greatest city of the ancient world left us a religion we cannot read, and a past we cannot quite claim. The people who composed the Rig Veda did not build cities. They did not leave carved seals or grid-planned streets. What they left was sound. Words shaped for memorization, passed mouth to ear across generations before anyone wrote down a syllable. Around 1800 to 1500 BCE, speakers of an Indo-European language entered the northwestern subcontinent through mountain passes. They brought horses, spoked-wheel chariots, and a portable religion of fire and song. They were not a single invading army. Migration is better. Slow and uneven. People moving in waves across centuries, herding cattle, fighting skirmishes, intermarrying with communities already living in the river valleys. This is the moment that shapes everything that comes after. And it is also the moment where history and politics collide most violently. The Rig Veda is the oldest strand of Hindu scripture, composed roughly between 1500 and 1200 BCE. It contains 1028 hymns addressed to deities who inhabit fire, wind, storm and sky. Indra, the thunder wielder, dominates, a warrior god who smashes fortresses with his Vajra, a weapon that crackles with lightning. In the hymns, Indra drinks rivers of Soma, a hallucinogenic plant pressed into juice, and grows drunk and invincible. He liberates cattle from demonic enclosures. He fights snakes and demons and establishes order in chaos. Agni, fire itself, is the messenger, the tongue that eats the offering and carries it upward to the gods. Varuna watches from above, maintaining cosmic order, binding oaths with unbreakable rope. These are not temple gods. No stone houses them. They arrive wherever a fire is kindled on open ground. They are beings made of natural forces, addressed in urgent language by people who need them to act. The hymns are prayers and demands, petitions and thanks, but they are not whispered intimately. They are shouted into the world, meant to be heard by beings powerful enough to ignore them. The ritual space was deliberately temporary. Vedic sacrifice required no permanent altar, no consecrated building, no priesthood living in a temple compound. Instead, 3 fires were laid out on open ground, and the sacred enclosure was constructed from grass and wooden posts that could be dismantled and moved. The ritual lasted hours, days, or in the great summer sacrifices, entire lunar cycles. At its centre was the offering. Ghee poured into flame, grain cast into heat, the pressed juice of the soma plant drunk and poured for the gods. The offering was meant to sustain the gods and bind them to their obligation, give and receive. The exchange that held the universe together. The payoff was transactional. Perform the ritual correctly, and the gods would respond. Bring rain. Grant a son. Ensure victory in battle. Grant passage to the world of ancestors after death. Increase the herds. Make the earth fertile. But the performance had to be exact. Not approximately correct, exactly correct. Mistakes annihilated the effect. A single mispronounced syllable, and the entire ritual was void. Worse than void. Dangerous. The misaligned word would bounce back on the performer. The gods would not come. Impurity would attach to the patron and his family. The sacrifice that should have brought blessing would bring curse. Precision was everything, and precision required specialists. This is where the Brahmin enters the historical record. The Vedas describe an emerging division of ritual labour. The hotri priest who recited Rig Veda, chanting the hymns at the right moment, knowing which god was addressed, in which hymn and what moment of the ritual each verse belonged to. The Advaryu who performed the physical actions, measuring and laying the fire, measuring and pouring the offerings, knowing the exact proportions and the exact directions. The Udgatri who sang the melodies, using the Samaveda to shape sound itself into a form that would reach the gods. Each function required years of memorization under a teacher. The knowledge was transmitted orally, and could be checked for accuracy only by listening to another person recite. If someone recited incorrectly, the entire group had to start over. The stakes were high. The effect was a monopoly. If you wanted a son, rain, victory, a good death, you paid a Brahmin to perform the ritual. You could not do it yourself. Your accent was wrong. Your memory was fallible. Your understanding was incomplete. Your caste was too low. Your birth did not permit you access to the sacred words. The patron sat at the edge of the sacred enclosure and watched men with memorized words do work he could not replicate. It was a perfect system for concentrating power. The Rig Veda does not describe a religion of personal devotion. There are no prayers whispered alone at night, no confession of sin to a forgiving deity, no mystical union with the divine through love, no sense that the gods care about your inner thoughts or your private struggles. The hymns are transactional. Give the gods their portion, and they will give you cattle, sons, long life, sunlight. The relationship is contract, not love. The god is an ally, not a friend. The transaction is impersonal but binding. And then, embedded in the 10th and youngest book of the Rig Veda, comes a hymn that would echo across 3,000 years of social history, with more force than any storm god ever mustered. It is called the Purusha Sukta, the hymn of the cosmic person, and it describes the first sacrifice, the one that made the universe itself. The hymn tells of Purusha, a primordial giant with 1,000 heads and 1,000 eyes and 1,000 feet. The gods seized him, spread him on sacrificial grass, and dismembered him. His body became the material of creation. From his mind came the moon, from his eye the sun, from his breath the wind, from his ear the directions of space. His feet became the earth. His skin became the plants. and from his body came the 4 categories of human beings. His mouth became the Brahmin, the priest, the keeper of the word, the one who speaks to the gods, the one who recites the Vedas and performs the rituals that keep the cosmos in order. His arms became the Rajanya, the warrior, the protector, the one who fights and rules. His thighs became the Vaishya, the merchant, the farmer, the one who works the land and produces the surplus that feeds everyone. And his feet became the Shudra, the servant, the one who serves the other 3, the one who exists to support the order. This is the first articulation of Varna in any Indian text. The hierarchy is not a human invention. It is not a temporary arrangement or a pragmatic division of labour. It is the shape of reality itself. The text does not suggest that a man born to Shudra parents might develop Brahmian qualities through learning and change his station. The categories are fixed by birth. They are cosmic categories. The cosmic person's mouth is still a Brahmin's mouth. The feet are still Shudra feet. The text goes further. It describes a sacrifice of this cosmic being, not a myth of the past, but an ongoing reality. The ritual the Brahmin performs echoes the original sacrifice that created the world. When the Brahmin pours ghee into the fire, he is participating in the act that sustains existence itself. This makes the Brahmin not just a specialist, but a cosmic functionary. The world depends on his precise performance. What the Rigveda does not contain is equally telling. There is no mention of karma, no doctrine of rebirth, no suggestion that actions in this life determine the next birth. The afterlife is a shadowy realm of ancestors, reachable through proper ritual. Those who die in battle go to a warrior's heaven. Those who die of old age, who leave descendants and property, join the ancestors in a realm we cannot quite see. But the sophisticated metaphysical architecture that would later define Indian thought, the cycle of birth and death, and birth again, the law of moral cause and effect operating across lifetimes, the idea that every action produces a consequence that must be paid in some future life, is entirely absent. The fire did not go out. The Rigvedic hymns are still chanted today in weddings and funerals and initiation ceremonies, with a precision that would be recognizable to the priests who first shaped them on the banks of the Saraswati River. But the world they created, a world in which a priestly class held the keys to the cosmos, and a 4-part hierarchy was baked into the flesh of a primordial being. That world was only the first draft. The argument over what Hinduism meant had already begun. Sometime around 800 BCE, a few centuries after the Rigveda was composed, something shifted in the Ganges plain. The fire altars were still burning, the Brahmins were still reciting, but in the forests beyond the villages, a different kind of religious life was beginning. And the people who began it did not leave their names. These were the rishis of the Upanishads, forest-dwelling sages who had watched the Vedic sacrifices their entire lives and had begun to ask a question the Vedas never asked. Not how do we get the gods to act, but what is real? Not which offering brings cattle, but who am I? Not how do we live well, but what is this living itself? They were asking the question that would later appear in the cave paintings and the stone circles, the question underneath all the other questions. The Upanishads introduce 3 concepts entirely absent from the Rigveda, and that would come to define Indian thought for the next 3,000 years. The first is karma. Every action produces a consequence, if not in this life then in a future one. The second is samsara, the cycle of birth and death and rebirth, the endless wheel turning forever. The third is moksha, liberation from that wheel, permanent escape from the cycle of suffering. None of this appears in the hymns to Indra. The Rigvedic poets wanted long life in this world, and a place among the ancestors in the next. The Upanishadic rishis looked at the same ritual system and concluded that it was a trap, Perform a sacrifice, get a reward, enjoy it, die, be reborn, perform another sacrifice. The cycle has no end. The only rational goal is to step off the wheel entirely, and the way to step off is through knowledge. Specifically, knowledge of the self. This is the central claim of the Upanishads. Atman is Brahman, the individual self. The deepest, truest you beneath the senses and the thoughts and the memories is identical with the ultimate reality that underlies the entire cosmos. Not connected to it, not created by it, not loved by it. Identical with it, there is no separation. There never was. That thou art, says the Chandogya Upanishad. I am Brahman, says the Brihadaranyaka. The salt dissolves in water, and you cannot see it, but you can taste it in every drop. The rivers flow into the ocean and lose their names, but the water is still water. The space inside a pot is the same space as the space outside it when the pot is broken. When you realize this, you realize there is no difference between you and the cosmos. You are not separate. You never were. If this is true, if the self is already what it seeks, already divine, already free, then the entire Vedic apparatus becomes secondary. The fire altar is useful, perhaps, for those not ready to face the truth, but it cannot deliver liberation. Liberation is not delivered. It is recognized. It is realized. It is the simple understanding that you have always been what you are seeking. The truth is not reached through years of sacrifice. It is recognized in a moment of insight. The implications for religious authority were corrosive. A Brahmin who knew the hymns by heart, but did not know his own self, was in this view a technician, not a sage. A man who could recite the entire Rig Veda without a single mistake was still ignorant of the ultimate truth. The true teacher was the one who had realized the identity of Atman and Brahman, regardless of birth. Lineage did not matter. Caste did not matter. Birth was not destiny here. Knowledge was. The Chandogya Upanishad tells of a boy of low birth whose father was unknown, yet he attains the highest knowledge. A daughter of a courtesan becomes a sage. The text breaks the Vedic rules, and then there is rebirth. The Upanishadic version is not hopeful. It is a diagnosis of a problem. You die and are reborn not because the gods are merciful, but because desire keeps pulling you back. The thirst for pleasure, the fear of pain, the clinging to a self that does not exist. These bind you to the wheel. The sage is the one who has burned away all desire, who wants nothing from the gods and nothing from the world. Because he has understood that he is what the gods are made of, for him there is no return. The cycle ends. He is freed. Where this idea came from is an open question. The Rig Veda knows nothing of rebirth. The earliest Upanishads present it as a new and secret teaching, something that must be learned from a qualified teacher, not something written in the old texts. Some scholars argue it developed organically within Vedic thought, a natural extension of the logic already implicit in karma and sacrifice. Others see influence from non-Vedic sources, the indigenous traditions of the Ganges Plain, with their own theories of how actions carry consequences, or the Shramana movements, wandering ascetics who rejected Vedic authority entirely. What is certain is that by 500 BCE, the doctrine of karma and rebirth was widespread across multiple Indian traditions, mentioned in texts that had no connection to each other, as though it had become common knowledge. By the 6th century BCE, the Vedic order was a machine of extraordinary complexity. It required Sanskrit, which ordinary people did not speak. It required priests, whose hereditary authority could not be questioned. It required offerings that the poor could barely afford, and it required a social hierarchy that told most people they were not the protagonists of their own spiritual lives, that their salvation or damnation rested on the actions of Brahmin priests. they could not see into and could not criticize, and then two men walked away. The first was Vardhamana, later called Mahavira, a prince who abandoned his palace at age 30. He tore out his hair by the roots. He walked naked for 12 years, allowing insects to crawl on his skin without brushing them away. The idea was that every living being, insect, plant, water droplet, contained a soul, and harming it created karmic debts that would bind you to the cycle of rebirth. What he arrived at was a vision of radical harmlessness, ahimsa, as the path to liberation. He rejected the Vedas entirely. He rejected caste. He rejected the idea that any priest could intercede between a person and their own salvation. The second was Siddhartha Gautama, also a prince. His father tried to seal him inside pleasure, away from suffering. But Siddhartha saw an old man bent with age, a sick man covered with disease, a corpse, a wandering ascetic, and he understood that the palace was a lie. He left at 29, sat beneath a fig tree at Bodh Gaya, and refused to move until he had understood the nature of existence. The answer he reached is almost clinical in its precision. Suffering exists. Suffering has a cause, craving, the endless wanting of things to be other than they are. Suffering can end, and there is a path to its ending, the eightfold path: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. No gods, no priests, no caste, no soul in the sense the Upanishads described. The Buddha taught anatta, no permanent self, and he taught it without flinching. If there is no permanent self, then there is nothing that persists from one life to the next. Rebirth still occurs, but what is reborn? Only the momentum of karma, the consequences of action, rolling forward like a wave. These were not small heresies. They were a complete alternative to the Vedic world. Merchants gravitated toward Buddhism and Jainism because these traditions did not care about birth. A merchant born into a merchant family could become a monk, could become a sage, could transcend his birth entirely. Women joined the monastic orders. Kings patronized the new movements because they offered a spiritual legitimacy that bypassed the Brahmin class. The Vedic establishment could not ignore this. The revenues of sacrifice dried up. The authority of inherited ritual status weakened. The philosophical critique was precise. If the Brahmins claimed the Vedas were eternal, where was the proof? If the ritual system promised good rebirth, why did an animal have to die for your spiritual advancement? The Buddha asked. If you pour a libation, does it reach the ancestors? You have no way to know. You are performing an action on the word of a priest who profits from your belief. What happened next is one of the most productive collisions in religious history. The Upanishads do not all predate the Buddha. Some, composed in the centuries after his death, bear the marks of this confrontation. The idea that the self, the Atman, is identical with ultimate reality had already been articulated. But now it had to be defended against a rival claim that there was no self at all. The Buddhist challenge forced the Vedantic thinkers to sharpen and deepen their vision. They had to explain how there could be no permanent self and yet rebirth occur. They had to explain the mechanism of karma, without a soul to carry it across lifetimes. Karma and rebirth were sharpened in this contest. The Buddhist version was rigorously psychological. Intention as the seed of action, moment-to-moment causation, the mind shaped by its own choices. The Jain version was almost physical. Karma as a material substance that attaches to the soul, accumulated through violent action, requiring purification through ascetic practice. The Hindu synthesis took both seriously and built a more flexible account. Rebirth became a mechanism not just of suffering but of cosmic justice, a way to explain inequality without blaming the gods. Why does one person have wealth and another suffer poverty? Not because of who they were in a previous life, but because of what they did. This is fair. This is logical. This is mercy in the shape of law. Buddhism did not kill Vedic religion. It forced it to evolve. The classical Hindu texts that emerged in the centuries after the Buddhist challenge were philosophical, defensive, complex in ways the Vedas had never been. And then, over centuries, Hinduism did something remarkable with the man who had caused so much trouble. It absorbed him. By the time the Puranas were composed, roughly between 300 and 1000 CE, the Buddha had become an avatar of Vishnu. The man who refused to speak of gods became a god. The tradition that had once threatened to destroy the Hindu order had been folded into it, made safe, incorporated. Hinduism did not have to defeat Buddhism. It had to be capacious enough to absorb it, and it was. Around 500 BCE, the religious landscape of northern India was a brawl of competing visions. Forest ascetics debated village priests. Princes renounced thrones. Monks argued about the nature of the self in a dozen dialects. Kings patronized different movements to increase their own spiritual prestige. The Vedic order was under attack, Buddhism was spreading, Jainism was strong, and yet something we might call Hinduism was not coalescing into a single unified thing. The Vedas were still sacred, but interpreted in different ways. The temple worship that would come to dominate Hindu practice in later centuries was not yet central. The caste system was present but not uniformly applied across all regions. Some areas had different hierarchies. Some communities did not recognize Varna at all. The situation persisted for almost 2,000 years. Hinduism was not a single religion. It was what we might call a religion family, a collection of related practices and texts and myths that shared some common elements, but did not require uniformity. You could be a Hindu if you honoured certain texts, but you did not have to believe in the same god as another Hindu. You could be a Hindu if you belonged to a certain region or family, but you did not have to perform the same rituals. And then the British arrived. The British did not come intending to invent a religion. They came to trade. But by the early 19th century, the East India Company was no longer a business. It was a government, ruling more people than lived in all of Western Europe. And governments need categories. In 1871, the first All-India census began. What the census takers found was a dense, overlapping ecosystem of practice. Some people worshipped Vishnu, others Shiva, others the goddess in her many forms. Some performed Vedic rituals. Some practiced forms of devotion that looked nothing like the Brahminical model. Some read the Puranas. Some read nothing and simply visited a local shrine on the right days, honoured the gods they had inherited from their grandparents, and asked for what they needed. The British official, educated at a public school and comfortable with the clarity of Church of England parish registers, where everyone knew exactly which parish they belonged to, looked at this and saw chaos, so he drew a line. On the census form he wrote Hindu, and he applied it to anyone who was not clearly Muslim, Christian, Sikh or Jain. Over 200 million people were suddenly and retrospectively classified as practitioners of the same religion. The word was not new. For centuries, Persian and Arab writers had used Hindu to mean the people who lived beyond the Indus River, a geographical term, not a religious one. Like calling someone European, the people themselves did not use it. A Shaiva devotee in Tamil country did not call himself a Hindu. A Vaishnava poet in Bengal did not call herself a Hindu. A Brahmin priest in Kerala did not identify with a Brahmin priest in Punjab as part of the same religion. Religion was local. It was inherited from your family. It was expressed in your language. It was plural. The census changed that. By the time the British had finished their counting, over 200 million people had been labelled Hindu whether they recognised the term or not. Once invented, the category began to take on a life of its own. Colonial law required classification to function. Property rights, inheritance, marriage, and criminal jurisdiction all depended on knowing which religious community a person belonged to. The British codified Hindu law by consulting Brahmin pandits, elevating one textual tradition over the hundreds of local customs that had actually governed people's lives. Custom that had been fluid became rigid. Categories that had been blurry became hard. But the British were not the only ones doing the shaping. Missionaries arrived with the East India Company and attacked what they called Hinduism as idolatry, superstition, and priestcraft. Their critique was dismissive and often cruel, but it forced a response. Indians could not defend what they had not yet named, so they began to name it. They began to claim it. They began to make it singular. Ramohan Roy, born in 1772 in Bengal, grew up fluent in Sanskrit, Persian, Arabic, and later English. He studied the Upanishads in the original and found a monotheism that he believed was the true core of the Indian tradition. Older, purer, and more rational than the idol worship he saw around him. In 1828, he founded the Brahmo Samaj, a reform movement that denounced image worship, rejected caste restrictions, and argued that the Vedantic doctrine of a single formless Brahman was the original religion of India. This was a claim of singular truth hidden beneath centuries of corruption. Roy was not simply describing an existing unity. He was arguing for one, extracting it from a tradition that had never demanded it. He was editing Hinduism, deciding what was essential and what was corrupt. In doing so, he began to shape what a modern, respectable, globally intelligible Hinduism might look like. If India had a philosophy to match European science, if Indians could point to a tradition of reason and monotheism that predated Christianity, then perhaps Indians deserved the same respect as Englishmen. The invention of Hinduism as a singular entity was partly an act of defense and partly an act of colonization, colonizing one's own tradition to meet the demands of a colonial world. Other reformers built on this foundation. Swami Dayananda Saraswati founded the Arya Samaj in 1875 and declared that the Vedas alone contained all truth. Everything after, Puranas, temple worship, caste by birth, he dismissed as corruption. The Vedas had to be reclaimed, purified, restored to their original meaning. The unity he was claiming was even more austere. Back to the earliest texts, away from the accretions of centuries. And then there was the Bhagavad Gita. The Gita is a poem of 700 verses, embedded inside the vast epic called the Mahabharata. Before the colonial period, it was respected. But it was not the central text of any major sect. It was not what Hindu philosophers pointed to as the ultimate authority. But British Orientalists admired the Gita for its narrative structure and philosophical content. They translated it. They taught it. They called it the Hindu Bible, a phrase that made no sense before they used it. Hinduism had never had a single Bible. It had texts, many texts, and they were often in tension with each other. But the colonial encounter created a hunger for a portable scripture that could be pointed to in argument with missionaries. The Gita was the obvious candidate. It was philosophical, it was about duty and self-transcendence. It seemed universal. By the late 19th century, it had become the text that defined modern Hinduism for the outside world, and increasingly for Hindus themselves. Nationalist leaders seized on this new unity. Bal Gangadhar Tilak wrote a commentary on the Gita that framed its teaching of selfless action as the spiritual basis for political struggle against British rule. He also revived the public Ganesh festival, transforming a local observance into a mass political spectacle. Religious symbols became nationalist symbols, mobilizing Hindus as a political bloc required a unified identity to mobilize. In the 20th century, this process accelerated. The term Hindutva was coined in 1923 and framed Hindus not merely as a religious community but as a nation, a shared culture, a shared land, a shared civilization. The borders of Hinduism began to harden. Communal identity became political. Religion became nationalism. The irony is complete. The civilization that had never called itself by a single religion was now being told by its own champions that its unity was ancient, essential, and under threat. A term borrowed from Persian travellers, standardized by British census takers, and mobilized by anti-colonial activists, had become the basis for a claim that Hinduism was not a product of history at all, but an eternal truth. The claim is powerful. It is also demonstrably new. The oldest continuously operating university in the world was founded by a woman who could not read a word. Fatima al-Fihri inherited a fortune from her father and paid for the construction of a mosque that would also house a school. The University of Al-Qarawiyyin opened its doors in 859 CE in the city of Fez. It has never closed them. 1,000 years before the first European university received a royal charter, students were gathering in Fez to argue about the stars, about language, about the nature of God. They sat in courtyards with teachers who had travelled from Egypt and Baghdad, debating theology and mathematics and astronomy. This is not an isolated story. It is a pattern that runs across continents because every major religious tradition also built an architecture of learning. Monasteries in Christian Europe kept the classical world alive after Rome fell. In the Scriptoria of Monte Cassino, monks copied not only the Bible but the works of Virgil, Ovid, Aristotle, the philosophy of Plato. The work was meticulous, the margins filled with illustrations. A wrong letter was a spiritual failure. Islamic madrasas taught algebra, optics, geography, medicine, theology. The great Buddhist university at Nalanda, founded in the 5th century CE, drew students from Korea, China, Tibet, Persia. It operated for 800 years, a beacon of learning in a region where monasteries were often the only places where advanced knowledge could be pursued before an invading army burned it to the ground. Learning was not the only structure religion built. It also built time. The 7-day week that governs the working lives of almost everyone on Earth has no astronomical basis. The sun rises and sets in a rhythm completely unrelated to the number 7. The only reason the 7-day week exists is because the Hebrew Bible says God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. From these 3 traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the week spread across the planet until it became so universal that most people never ask why their calendar behaves this way. The annual festivals that punctuate human life, Christmas and Easter, Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha, Diwali and Passover, follow the same logic. Each of these is a religious observance before it is a national holiday. Christmas exists because of the Christian claim about when Jesus was born. Easter exists because of the Christian claim about resurrection. Diwali celebrates the victory of light over darkness in the Hindu epic. Passover commemorates the Exodus from Egypt. Every calendar carries theology inside it. The need to calculate holy days accurately drove some of the most significant advances in astronomy. Easter's date depends on a complex lunisolar formula. The first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. To calculate that correctly across centuries requires a sophisticated understanding of lunar cycles and their relationship to the solar year. Islamic astronomy was driven by the need to determine the Qibla, the direction of Mecca, from any point on Earth. If you are a merchant in Delhi, how do you know which direction to face in prayer? The answer requires spherical geometry, precise latitude and longitude, understanding of the Earth's curvature. The astronomers of Baghdad, Damascus, and Samarkand produced star charts centuries ahead of their European contemporaries. They were not doing science in opposition to faith. They were doing science because faith demanded precision. The same pattern holds for the printed word. The first major book off Gutenberg's press, around 1450, was the Bible. The demand for sacred texts created the market that made the printing press a commercial success worth investing in. Without the religious demand, the technology might have languished. In China, the earliest known printed book is a Buddhist sutra from 868 CE, centuries before Gutenberg. The technology spread because people wanted to hold the word of God in their hands, wanted to distribute it, wanted to preserve it against loss. Religion organized space. Pilgrimage routes moved millions of people across continents. The Hajj to Mecca drew tens of thousands annually from West Africa, Central Asia, India. The Camino de Santiago in Spain funneled Christians toward the shrine of St. James, creating economic networks and cultural exchanges along the way. The Kumbh Mela, a Hindu pilgrimage that rotates between 4 sacred river sites every 12 years, is the largest single gathering of human beings on Earth, drawing more than 100 million people in recent decades. These movements were not just spiritual exercises. They were economic, cultural, epidemiological. They moved goods, transmitted knowledge, spread disease. All of this rested on a deeper structure, law. Every major religious tradition produced a legal code that ordered marriage, inheritance, contracts, diet, dress, sexual behavior, criminal justice. For most of human history, most people never encountered a secular court. The law they lived under was religious law, a Brahmin's Dharma Shastras, a Muslim's Sharia courts, a Christian's canon law. These governed the most intimate decisions of people's lives. The concept of universal human rights is often traced to the Enlightenment philosophers of 18th century Europe, but the idea that a contract is binding, that a promise made in public carries moral weight across generations, that the powerful are answerable to a standard higher than themselves. These entered Western legal thought through centuries of canon law and Jewish jurisprudence. The Magna Carta was issued by an English king under pressure from barons, but it was framed in the language of divine law, of rights that could not be transgressed because they were ordained by God. The American Declaration of Independence asserts that all men are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights. Where did the idea come from that every person, regardless of birth, had equal standing before law? It came from the religious idea that every person is created in the image of God. In 1481, in the city of Seville, 6 people were burned alive. Their crime was practicing Judaism in secret after being forcibly baptized as Christians. A tribunal of church-appointed judges had interrogated them and handed them over for execution. The crowd watched. This was the first auto da fe of the Spanish Inquisition. By the time the Inquisition was abolished, it had executed thousands of people across Europe and the Americas. The pattern is not confined to one faith or one century. In 1099, Crusader armies breached the walls of Jerusalem. When they entered the city, they killed everyone they could find: Muslim defenders, Jewish families, Armenian Christians, Coptic Christians, none were spared. One eyewitness wrote that the blood in the Temple Mount reached the knees of the horses. This is not metaphor. The accounts from that day describe a massacre systematic enough that the streets ran literally wet. Spanish and Portuguese conquerors arrived in the Americas, carrying swords and crucifixes. They read aloud a legal document in Spanish, a language no one there could understand, informing indigenous people that the Pope had granted their lands dans to the Spanish crown, and that they must accept Christianity or face war and enslavement. Then the killing began. The population of the Americas fell by roughly 90% in the first century after contact. Disease accounted for much of it. Smallpox and measles and influenza did what no army could do. But conquest and slavery and deliberate killing accounted for significant portions. The foundation of Spanish America was built on indigenous labour and indigenous death. The 20th century saw the same logic on an industrial scale. The Armenian genocide was carried out by the Ottoman government, partly justified through Islamic legal categories that framed non-Muslims as a separate and expendable class. The Holocaust was not in any simple sense a religious crime, but centuries of Christian anti-Judaism had laid the groundwork. The ghettos of medieval Europe, the accusations of blood libel, the expulsions from England, France, and Spain, the preaching from pulpits that the Jews were Christ killers, all made it possible for millions to accept that Jews were a problem to be solved. For 3,000 years, the Purusha Sukta of the Rig Veda has been cited to justify a social order in which millions of people were born into untouchability. By the time the British arrived, what they recorded was not a philosophical concept. It was a lived reality of exclusion, violence, and ritual pollution, stretching back longer than any other continuous system of social hierarchy on the planet. The fact that reformers in every century, from the Buddha to the medieval Bhakti saints to B.R. Ambedkar, fought against it does not alter the fact that the sacred text was used to build and maintain a system of oppression. And none of this stands alone. Every major religious tradition lives with a history of complicity in suffering. To tell the story honestly means holding both halves in view at the same time. The hospitals and the pyres, the universities and the smashed idols, the mystics who fed the hungry and the judges who signed the death warrants. The same text used to liberate and to oppress. The sky has not changed. The stars are exactly where they were when the Neanderthal woman laid flowers beside a body in Shanadar Cave 60,000 years ago. They are exactly where they were when the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree, when a merchant in a cave near Mecca heard a voice telling him to recite, when a rabbi in Jerusalem was crucified, and when his followers claimed he had risen. The same dots of light, the same silent question hanging beneath them. What is all of this? Why does it exist? Why do I exist? And what am I supposed to do while I am here? No religion has answered that question to everyone's satisfaction. Every religion tried. The trying changed the world. It built cathedrals and universities and legal systems and calendars. It gave millions of people a reason to get up in the morning and a story to tell themselves when someone they loved died. It also gave other people a reason to burn books, to enforce caste, to march armies across continents under the sign of a cross or a crescent. For most of human history, the question was not whether to ask, but how. Today, for the first time, large populations live without religious belief. Entire nations have become secular societies, where the gods of the old text are treated as cultural heritage rather than living authorities. This is new. It has never happened before at scale. The experiment is only a few centuries old. But it does not mean the question has gone away. The secular age inherited the categories that religion carved into human thought. The idea that every person has inherent dignity, that is a proposition with religious roots, even if it is now defended on philosophical grounds alone. The impulse toward universal justice, toward a reckoning that transcends individual lifetimes, toward the possibility that things could be different. These are shapes of thinking that religion hammered into place over millennia. The original question, why exist, what to do, what comes after, has not been retired. It surfaces in different language now. People speak of purpose, of meaning, of mental health. They consult therapists where their grandparents consulted priests. They post photographs of the night sky on social media, captionless. as if the image alone can carry what they cannot quite say. They scroll through infinite feeds, searching for something, some hint that they matter, that their existence adds up to something other than pleasure and pain, and then nothing. The composite human figure who opened this story is still standing beneath the stars. The face has changed, the clothing has changed, the language in which the question is asked shifts from Sanskrit to Hebrew, to Arabic, to English, to code to the languages we have not yet invented. But the tilt of the head, the eyes scanning the darkness, the silent pause, these have not changed in 60,000 years. What the evidence tells us is this: no god has appeared in the sky to settle the argument. No text has been discovered that resolves every dispute about its own meaning. No prophet, priest, or philosopher has produced an answer that convinced everyone who heard it. The search produced civilization, art, law, education, atrocity, beauty, and grief. It did not produce agreement. That is not a failure of religion. It is a fact about the question. Some questions do not have answers that can be written down and handed to the next generation like a finished object. They have to be asked again. Every person born into the world encounters the sky for the first time. No inherited theology can do the work for them. No answer passed down from a parent carries the same weight as the one you reach yourself. The story told here is not a story about which answer was correct. It is a story about what billions of people did with the question while they were alive. Some of what they did was magnificent. Some of it was monstrous. Most of it falls somewhere in between. In the space where ordinary people try to hold their lives together and make sense of loss, and find a reason to be kind when kindness costs something. The institutions they built became corrupt. The texts became weapons. The rituals became barriers. And then new people came along and broke the idols, and wrote new texts and started new arguments, and the whole thing continued. Reform followed oppression. Vision followed corruption. The conversation went on. It is continuing now. The looking continues.